Okay, so today we're going to be talking about operations with complex numbers. So remember that we've already talked about an imaginary number I that equals the square root of -1. It can be written as the square root of a negative number. Okay, so anytime you have a square root of a negative number, that's an imaginary number. Also, something that you need to know is I squared equals a -1, because if you were to square the square root of a -1, remember when you multiply a radical times itself, it just gets rid of the radical, which would equal -1. So anytime your answer has an I squared in it, make sure that you're replacing that with an I squared, or a -1. Okay, so complex number. A complex number in standard form is A plus BI. A is your real part, and B is your imaginary part. Okay, so when you're adding and subtracting complex numbers, it says to add or subtract two complex numbers, you're adding their real parts and their imaginary parts separately. So an I, we've talked about it before, an I is just like a variable. So you're just going to be combining like terms. Okay, so you add or subtract the real parts, add or subtract the imaginary parts. So let's look at this first example at the bottom. We're subtracting. Notice, always look at the middle. We are subtracting. It says write the complex number in standard form. We just went over that, A plus BI. So A is your real part, your BI is your imaginary part. Okay, so we're going to be subtracting. So notice this is a real part, and so is this. We're subtracting. So 6 minus 4 would give us 2. And then we're going to look at our imaginary part. Now on this part, I'm going to write this step down because we are doing 3I. We are subtracting, because that's what's in the middle, a negative I, which would actually be plus, because you're subtracting a negative. 3I plus I would equal 4I. So that'd be plus 4I. Now, I just said I is just like a variable. So if you had a 3x plus an x, you would get a 4x. Okay? You're not able to add 2 and 4I. So that would be your answer there. So always check the inside to see what operation you're doing. So in between it. So notice on part B, in the middle we're adding. So you're going to look at your real parts. So 2 and 7. So that would give you 9. And then you have a 5I, we're adding a -2I. So 5I plus a -2I would give you a positive 3I. Again, we're not able to add those together, so that is your standard form of a complex number. Okay, let's take a look at multiplying. So we just added and subtracted. It's just like combining like terms. Now we're going to look at multiplying them. Okay, so notice that it says write the expression 2 plus I times -5 plus 2I as a complex number in standard form. So we just went over standard form. It's A plus BI. So that's the form that you always need to write your answer into, or in. So notice that we have a binomial times a binomial. Anytime you're multiplying two binomials, you're using FOIL. So we're going to multiply the first terms together. So that would be -10, and then the outside numbers together, so that would be 4I, and then the insides, so that would be -5I, and then the last terms. So again, I is just like a variable, so when you have I times 2I, you get 2I squared. Okay, so you're going to combine like terms. So notice on the middle, we have I's, just like an X. We're going to combine those. So that's -10. When you combine the I's, you get -1I, or you can just write -I. And then you have plus 2I squared. Now remember on the front, I told you I squared equals a -1. So anytime I squared is in your answer, you need to replace it with a -1. I'm going to have 2 times a -1. So instead of writing I squared, you're replacing it with a -1. Okay, so that's going to end up giving you a -2 there, and then you'll be able to combine it with a -10. So that would give you a -12 minus I for your answer. Okay, so make sure it says standard form. There's not an I squared in standard form. So if you end up with an I squared, you should be replacing it with a -1. Okay, so now we're going to go over all of that, adding, subtracting, and multiplying. So on number 1, we're subtracting. Look at the middle. So we're going to subtract the real parts. 12 minus 16 would give you a -4. And then we're looking at the imaginary parts. We have a -2i, but remember, we're subtracting 3i, which would give you a -5i. So always check the sign in between the two complex numbers. So notice on example 2, we have parentheses, and we have a term on the outside of the parentheses. So we will distribute here. So we will be multiplying. So when we distribute, we get -4, actually, that would be -36i, because we're multiplying. And then when you distribute that, you get -20i squared. We just went over I squared. We're replacing that with a -1. So that will end up giving you a +20. Now remember, in standard form, it's A first, which is your real part, then your imaginary part. So that 20 needs to go first, then minus 36i. Okay, so looking at 3, notice we are adding in between. So we're going to add the real parts. 4 plus a -6, we get -2. And then 4i plus 3i, which would give you 7i, because you're just adding. Can't add those. That's in standard form, so that would be our answer. So a complex number has a real part and then an imaginary part, which just means you have an I part of it. I is just like a variable, so you're only combining the things that look the same. And then remember, if you have an I squared in your answer, replace it with a -1.